Hi, and welcome to Molden and Schmidt, the podcast where we get to the bottom of the big questions about the future of motoring and, crucially, how we make it more sustainable. I'm Nick Molden. I'm the founder and chief executive of Emissions Analytics, which is a company that does independent real-world testing to understand what vehicles really emit on the road, not just from the classic tailpipe, but from any bit of the vehicle that is causing a problem for the environment. And with me is Oliver Schmidt. Hi, Oliver. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Nick. Yes, I'm Oliver Schmidt. I'm a veteran of the automotive industry for more than 20 years. But unfortunately, of course, I'm most known for my involvement into the Volkswagen Dieselgate.
And in a sense, we were on the opposite sides of the table, and that's why I thought this podcast was always a good idea to bring those
Yeah.
two sides together and try and see how we see the future.
Yeah.
So today we're going to talk about tyres. Now, tyres is possibly the most interesting, boring issue in motoring, or possibly the most boring, interesting issue in motoring. You be the judge. But tyres are so crucial. They are the only bit of the vehicle in contact with the road. So you are propelling a 2-ton vehicle around on 4 rubbery contact patches. So those tyres have to do a lot of work. So actually, what they're made of, how they perform, how reliable they are, is crucial to your safety and crucially your emissions through the efficiency of the vehicle, through the resistance, but also those tyres are wearing. It sounds obvious when you say it, but that wear means that small rubbery particles are being released into the environment. And we can't see them. What that means is that they're very, very small. So actually, do we have an issue here which is similar to tailpipe emissions? Lots and lots of microscopic, invisible particles. Well, this topic has actually recently become, and if you pardon the expression, one of the hottest potatoes in the car world. And research that we've done at Emissions Analytics to show the level of tyre emissions has been, on the one hand, rubbished by one part of the debate to say, well, there's no problem. You're saying it's all about EVs and this is a new problem that you've never spoken about before. On the other hand, the anti-EV, anti-progress part are saying how tyre emissions are so much worse than tailpipe emissions, and this is a new terrible thing, and therefore we need to stop electrification immediately. So what we want to do today is try and get to the bottom of that. Key facts are that we make about 3 billion new tyres every year, and roughly a car will shed about 2 kilograms per year from its 4 tyres if you drive it around
Yeah.
in an average sort of way. That's a lot of stuff. And what we've found is that tailpipe particle emissions, as of the last 10 or 15 years, has largely been solved. There's virtually no particles coming out of the exhaust. And that leads us to the conclusion that tyre emissions are about 1,000 times greater from the tyres than from the tailpipe now, largely driven by how clean the tailpipe is. So that's our basic proposition. But of course, all cars have tyre emissions, whether they're internal combustion engines or electric vehicles. It affects both. But what we're saying is that is now the dominant thing over the tailpipe. So that's the sort of background and the research we've got to so far. Oliver, I mean, for you, what's the crux of the tyres issue from your point of view?
Okay. Of course, the big problem I see with electric vehicles is the added weight of the electric vehicle. The electric vehicle has to carry these huge batteries to take away the range anxiety from people. So batteries get bigger and bigger. And of course, to pack a big battery in your car, you need to make the car bigger. If you look at the recent big SUVs that came out as electric vehicles, or even worse in my eyes, the pickup trucks in the US, like the Cybertruck or the Rivian, those are huge vehicles, very, very heavy. with our European regulation, there are even some that you can't drive with your normal driver's license anymore. You need a truck driver's license to drive those vehicles. So that's the one driver of why are there so many particles coming, or tire emissions coming from electric vehicles. We know from studies and from people reporting that we have about 25 to 50% more tire emissions from an electric vehicle than we have from an internal combustion engine, if we compare the vehicles in size and performance. Of course, not in weight, because the electric vehicle will be heavier. And then the problem is what is happening with those tire emissions. As you already mentioned, Nick, one problem is the particles. So we have this debris laying everywhere. So it gets shed off the tires, and then where does it stay? It doesn't disappear. You find this everywhere. You find this in human bodies by now, but the majority is laying on the streets. And in the US, we have the huge problem of the rivers and the lakes being next to the roads, and every time when they have a rain coming through, or a heavy rain, then the tire debris gets washed into the lake or the sea, and we have a huge dying of fish population. And now we ask ourselves, why is the fish population dying when this comes in? It's not because of the particles. In the tire itself is a chemical stabilizer for the tire called 6-ppd, which makes the tire not age under sunlight and under ozone. But when it's laying on the streets and the sun is baking on these little particles, it turns into something called 6-ppdq. And the problem of 6-ppdq is it's toxic. It's not toxic for everybody and everything all the time, but it's toxic to a lot of fish stock. And we know that there are areas in the US where native tribes are now suing the EPA and the tire manufacturer and everybody they can get hold of, because it takes away their base of their life. They are dependent on their fishing and the fish stock in the lakes. I think those are the two problems that we produce: the particulates and the 6-ppdq. And these both get produced on a higher rate by electric vehicles than on normal ICE engines.
And 6-ppd is a particularly knotty problem because there is no current alternative to it that's any less toxic. And it's one of the interesting, the regulator, the Californian Environmental Protection Agency, has brought in a rule not to ban 6-ppd or limit it, but to force tyre manufacturers to look for alternatives. So if they want to keep selling tyres in California, they have to prove that they've tried to find alternatives. But essentially, 6-ppd is so effective that we can't do without it at the moment. But what our chemical testing of tyres has found at Emissions Analytics, an interesting finding is that the proportion of 6-ppd in different tyres varies hugely. There are now some tyres on the market which have quite low concentrations of 6-ppd, and they're still lasting as well as the ones with greater concentration. So there is a way forward there, but 6-ppd in a way has become the poster boy for tyre emissions, because it was the piece of research that ripped the lid off this. It was when the susceptibility of the coho salmon on the west coast of the US, they were shown to kill off more than 50% of the fish stocks. And now they're gradually finding that some other fish are susceptible, others are not susceptible, but a lot are. And it's not just fish as wildlife, it's fish as major commercial industries in the US. So it is focusing people's minds. On the particle side, one thing I'd like to add is that there's an interesting conundrum again here, that you don't see these particles generally easily either in the air or, but it's not like the classic old tailpipe with a puff of black smoke. It's not that. We don't see anything. And the research is suggesting that actually it's made up of two things. It's made up of bigger bits of rubber that fall to the road and then get washed into the rivers and seas and kill the salmon, but also some very, very fine nanoscale particles, which hang in the air for a long time. And we've in fact found tire particles in snow deposits in the Colorado mountains, for example. So
Okay.
the traveling a long distance. So in a way, we're seeing the effects of tire emissions at quite a long distance away from the vehicles themselves. So it really does. It creates a lot of challenges for regulators. How do you see that regulators are beginning to address this,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
is it being very effective? How do you think they should
Yeah,
play
so so
this?
so, so I think you already mentioned one branch of the regulators, the American regulators. They are going the typical approach that I know from the US. It's always called the materials of concern. So every time when there's I would not say a chemical found in a car, but when there's a chemical and there are too many disadvantages of carrying on this certain material or chemical in a car, the US legislation always first comes out and tells you, please look for an alternative. And then a few years later, you will see a regulation coming out telling you you have to reduce it by 25% in the fleet in that year. The next year it's 50%, then it's 75, and then it's maybe 90 for the next 2 years, and then it's 100%. So the car manufacturers are given a chance to remove this chemical from your whole fleet. And my prediction is the same will happen with 6 ppd as soon as there's an alternative, or as you mentioned, there are tires that use less 6 ppd, then those tires will get promoted. If the in the research that is now being conducted by all the manufacturers for tires in the US, based on this California EPA proposal, once they come up with a study that says, okay, we can reduce 6 ppd in the tires by X percent, then they will say, okay, the new value is then the threshold, please stay with there. So that's the American approach. My personal opinion on this is this creates innovation. This approach creates innovation. If you basically encourage and then later force the manufacturer to dig into developing alternatives. So now we go to Europe. The European approach is a totally different one. In Europe, they are trying to limit the amount of particulates being being emitted in a certain driving cycle. And at the moment, they are trying to use the WLTP in the certification test as this test for it. But from your studies, we know that the amount of particulates in gram is so small that's being emitted in the WLTP that it's very, very difficult to measure. I don't want to make fun of it, but for me, this sounds really like you have to treat your emission laboratory like a surgical room. So once you have done the first test, you have to send in the cleaning crew to clean it so that you have every milligram of particle that's in this room removed so the next test can be conducted. So what I see there, the European regulation at the moment promotes the development of measurement technology, not of an alternative for this. And we have seen this issue with the NOx problem in the 90s. So in the 90s, we had a NOx problem in the US and of course in Europe, or in the 80s, starting maybe even earlier. And so we came up with regulation, European emission regulation, American emission regulation, and NOx was being regulated. And NOx could only be measured in the emissions lab. It could not be measured anywhere else. So, and then we know the story. We have introduced the story in our first podcast. Companies like your company, Emission Analytics, came up with a way to measure those NOx emissions on the road. And I predict this exactly the same will happen with the tire particulates and on top with the brake dust here in Europe. We will be in a first in a state of happiness. We will all pass the test, but we are not going to know what's happening outside the test. So, and then we will be all astonished once we get a measurement that is not driven at 120K max of the WLTP, but at 150K, and we see triple the amount or whatever. I don't know yet. But I'm very afraid that we get, I will not say a repetition of Dieselgate, but that we get something similar. we are developing at the moment here in Europe the tire and the whole testing equipment only for this small test, and we are not forcing the development of new materials.
Yeah, so and I think it's fair to say that the European Commission is chastened by what happened with Dieselgate, which, and you
Yeah.
mentioned that's the nitrogen oxides and the diesel scandal. Sufficiently chastened by that. What they're doing while new measurement techniques are being developed is applying a very simple on-road approach. So vehicles or tires will have to be driven for 8,000 kilometers, and there'll be
Okay.
a simple method that weighs the tires at the beginning and end, and the mass
Okay.
lost over
Yeah.
8,000 kilometers will be divided by the distance driven, will be the wear rate. Now, it is a crude method in a sense, but it is real world. So
Yeah.
that's to make sure that's their effort to make sure that there isn't a repeat of the Dieselgate scandal.
Okay.
My concern is that because it is only using mass loss, and these very small nanoscale particles essentially have no
Hmm.
mass, it'll be
Yeah.
completely unsighted on that. It will
Yeah.
also be unsighted on the chemical composition. So whether a particle is high in 6 ppd or low in 6 ppd, or whether it has other toxic chemicals, will not feature in this regulation at all. So,
Hmm.
I mean, in a sense, we have gone from no interest in tyres to a high interest in tyres, and the regulators have actually responded quite quickly. But I think it's important they don't stop there at this very simple test. It is very
Yeah.
important they progress fast beyond that to take into account ultrafine particles and the chemical composition as well. And you know, I don't know. We're not talking about introducing this basic test until the back end of this decade for it to be
Yeah.
fully
I
enforced.
know. Yeah.
So I'm concerned that we're going to be well into the next decade before we look at the other aspects. So I would prefer to see a parallel running of
Yeah.
the chemical side. But I don't know if that's whether you think that's a viable proposition, or Europe is just going to focus in a very singular fashion on this mass loss
Yeah.
method.
What's pretty funny is this is exactly the opposite that we have on the nitrous oxide emissions. If you look for particulates, no, particulate emissions, sorry, for particulate emissions, tailpipe emissions in Europe. In Europe, we are counting particles and we are measuring weight. The US is only measuring weight at a much lower ratio than Europe. I think it's times 4, the ratio between the two in milligrams per kilometer in the test. But that's actually, I think it's pretty astonishing that this is now reversed in this regulation. So I didn't know about the 8,000 kilometer test. So when was this decided?
So
Or is it just a proposal at the moment?
it is now, to all intents and purposes, legislated within the Euro 7. So there have
Okay,
been since
they put
90,
it in now. Yeah, okay.
yeah. So since 1992, there have been the various stages of emissions legislation. We're currently at Euro 6, which regulates the pollutant emissions. So Euro 7 is the one slated to come in the next couple of years. But as you
Yeah,
mentioned, there's a lack of measurement methodologies. So the tyres part of it, which is a new thing for the Euro standards, is only going to come in once this 8,000 kilometer method has been finalized
yeah,
by a group at the United Nations. They've actually
yeah,
made very fast progress on it, so it is impressive in many ways.
yeah,
But I am there is a concern that once it's in place, everyone will relax and think we've covered
yeah.
off. And I
The,
think
the, the,
my interpretation of the motivation for it, which brings us back to the topic of battery electric vehicles, is that the concern from the European Commission's point of view is that tyre emissions could be a spanner in the works for electrification. So they don't
yeah,
want, having pushed us massively to buy battery electric vehicles, then they find it suddenly created some unintended consequence for elevated tyre
yeah.
emissions. And so this is trying to guard against that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This leads back to the one thing I mentioned earlier with the battery electric vehicle is a totally different animal than the internal combustion engine vehicle, and we know why do we love driving electric vehicles? Because of the torque that we have, the full amount of torque available at at the start, and that it's not like an internal combustion engine that it's building up its torque and its power over the RPM range. So it's easier to accelerate faster with an electric vehicle, and people do it. We know it. We know that there are vehicles that have a very huge tire wear because they are driven fast all the time. Somebody that owns a Tesla Plaid S at least a few times will show off the acceleration possible.
The
And
ludicrous
if
mode.
I now yeah, the ludicrous mode. If you now put then the electric vehicle in the same test as the ICE vehicle and drive in the same style, of course you will not see the real world emission depending on the driving style. I would
Yeah.
say that the driving style of the electric vehicle is, I wouldn't call it aggressive. It's a bit faster in the takeoff because of the available torque. Even the smallest electric vehicle has, I don't know, 500, 600 Newton meters of torque, while the gasoline equivalent has maybe 350
Yeah.
at 4,000 RPMs. Yeah.
Yes, that I mean that's absolutely right, and the evidence is showing that if you give people this ability to accelerate, they will tend to use it. But to be fair to electric vehicles, there are a small group of people, a minority, who drive electric vehicles in a way that's much less aggressive than internal
Yeah.
combustion engines. Essentially, it comes from the regenerative braking, which is effectively
Yeah.
using the motors as effectively a dynamo to slow the vehicle rather than the foot brake. And if you have the right mentality and you adopt a very eco-friendly driving style, you can actually lead to lower tire emissions in practice. So that is a
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
possibility, but
Yeah.
empirically, most people tend to what you described. And if you have that acceleration under your foot, they will
Yeah.
have a tendency to use it. But I wanted to add one other thing. There's an interesting wrinkle, or should I say, a running debate in this topic, where we say, and from our research, and you mentioned the 25% figure, so a like for like battery electric vehicle wears tires about 25% more, roughly speaking. Uh, but evidence that's put forward to counteract that is to say, oh, the tires on my EVs, they don't wear any faster, they last just as long as the set on my last internal combustion engine. Now that actually is often true, and I believe that. But the key thing there is the lifespan of the tires is not the same as the tire wear rate in the sense of tire emissions. And the difference is that the size of the wheels on electric
Yeah.
vehicles are typically bigger. So
Yeah.
you can
Exactly.
have a bigger wheel with a bigger tire that lasts just as long as your old internal combustion engine smaller wheel, but because
Yeah.
it is bigger, the mass
Yeah.
loss per mile or
Yeah.
kilometer driven is higher.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's why anyone who puts forward evidence to say, my tires last just as long, you have to interpret that and take that with a big pinch of salt. The question then to ask is, how big? How big are those tires?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, because that is the easy metric that comes to people's hands,
Yeah.
that's muddying the debate and making people relax because, yeah, my tires
Mm.
last longer, therefore I'm not polluting the environment. In fact, it's you have to be aware of bigger vehicles with bigger tires because actually the
Yeah.
wear rate is higher as a result.
Yeah. Yeah. We know that the diameter goes into the evaluation, and the if I have an whatever 18-inch wheel on my old car and have a 20-inch wheel on my electric SUV, the tire is much wider. I have a whatever 225 to compared to a 265 millimeter in width of the tire, and I have a huge bigger diameter. You're totally right. I have more mass of tire available. But then when we come back to the 8,000 kilometer test you described, then the wear for the bigger tire should be much higher than the wear for the other tire. But the amount of thread being left after the test will be the same on both tires. But there is, just because of the larger diameter and the wider tire, there's just more thread that can be, I don't know
Exactly.
how to say it, can be put into particles or can be used off or whatever.
Exactly. I think it would be worth tell us from the industry side, from your perspective, why are vehicles becoming bigger and heavier, and are battery electric vehicles getting even bigger and heavier than internal combustion engines? So
Yeah,
what's
yeah.
driving it? Why is this
So,
happening?
so I would say the trend is not only electric vehicles getting bigger and heavier; it's all vehicles getting bigger and heavier. It just, if you go into old car magazines and you take out in whatever 1980s Mercedes S class, you're at 1,500 kilograms or somewhere around that area. If you take the current Mercedes S class, you're at 2.2 tons. So we have 700 kilograms more. Why does it come in? I think it's us lazy customers. It's us lazy customers, and it's all the assistance systems. So in the 80s S class, you maybe had two airbags, driver and passenger. Now you have, I don't know, 20 or how many airbags. You have knee, you have side, you have head, you have whatever airbag in your car. So that adds weight. You have all this, the safety systems. Of course, people want to feel safer. So the car gets, and they want to have more comfort. So the cars get bigger. You can do the same evaluation if you go in whatever vehicle you pick and you look how they got bigger in size. Over the generation, they always get bigger and bigger. I always remember this at Volkswagen. I think it was the sixth generation Polo was the size of the first generation Golf. So this is, cars just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's because we want the comfort in the car. We all want air conditioning. Do you remember when growing up, did your parents had a car with air conditioning? Mine had not.
Not
So
until quite
did
late
you
on.
have did you have electric windows in the cars? No, you had not. You had to crank the windows, and all this, of course, adds weight to the vehicles.
But am I right that it's also in the interest of the manufacturer, by putting on these extra features, they can make more profit margin? So, in a sense, consumers want it, but also manufacturers want it as well. So
Yeah,
everything
of course.
points in the direction of getting heavier.
If I sell you something for 50,000 euros and get a 7%, 8% margin or whatever my plan is, or I sell you something for 100,000 and get the same margin of it, the higher my price point, the more money I make. And we all know this. This is back in the days when you had still to buy your radio in your car. And we all had this one little slot in the car for the radio. So if I bought the radio through the manufacturer, I paid 1,000 marks for a radio that in the supermarket I could get for 80, quality wise. But because I was lazy, I didn't want to install it myself. So I had to do this. So now if I put all this together and then add the weight of the battery and add range anxiety to it, I think this is the reason why cars get bigger and heavier. And
And this,
one thing I want to mention there, and I think then we can wrap it up. But the one thing that also adds to it is all the safety systems that are required to pass the NCAP test with 5 stars. NCAP is the crash test that is important for your insurance classification. So, and there you have a system of stars that you have to achieve. And now, even if you would build a car that delivers the perfect crash test and you hit a wall with 60 kilometers an hour straight on, everybody would walk away from the car unhurt. You would not get 5 stars because all the assistance systems like lane assist, emergency braking, and everything that, needs to be in there, so you get those 5 stars. So all the safety equipments, like I mentioned earlier, the airbags, adds to the weight. So it's the safety systems, it's our comfort demand that we have, it's our demand for more size that we have, and it's the range anxiety in the case of the battery electric vehicles that makes the car bigger and heavier.
and I would add to that as well, there are some things in the taxation system that also incentivize bigger and heavier cars. But what you've described is essentially a philosophy. It's fine for these vehicles to become bigger and heavier because we'll deal with the impact on through these extra systems. The vehicle safety systems will help make them that improvement in safety justifies them becoming bigger and heavier. What we're seeing through this is that comes with this hidden downside with other pollutant emissions, particularly tire wear. And I think just to my final thing that I would add to the tires, the bit that further bit that no one thinks about is, as these vehicles are becoming bigger, these tires are not just becoming wider in diameter, they're also becoming bigger in surface area. And what that means is actually the chemicals inside tires actually evaporates off the surface, and those chemicals some of them are toxic themselves, but they also contribute to air quality problems, particularly smog formation, and particularly in hotter countries. So in a way, we're coming full circle, having started with dealing with air pollution and smog in Los Angeles, leading to the original Clean Air Act in America, and having gone through many iterations of regulation. We're now introducing bigger tires that may well be bringing back that smog formation problem just through these things becoming bigger on the vehicle. So we're not going to be able to address everything here today, but that's a quick canter through, Cindy, why everyone should be really interested in tires. They are crucial to the vehicle. They're crucial to the economy, keeping cars and logistics going, but they are this hidden source of pollution. And I imagine, Oliver, we will come back to this in more detail as the evidence unfolds over the months. So thank you very much for your input today. Thank you everyone for listening. You've been listening to Molden and Schmidt with me, Nick Molden from Emissions Analytics.
And me, Oliver Schmidt.
Thanks, Oliver, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.